Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. My name is Isabel Chiriboga, and I'm an Assistant Director at the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. We appreciate all of you for joining us today for the latest conversation of our Colombia Voices of Impact video series. Throughout this and the following discussions, we will highlight the importance of leaders at the local and international levels who are driving crucial agendas for the country's development. These series will play a crucial role in shaping the narrative on priorities and opportunities for the future of the relationship between the United States and Colombia. We aim to incorporate a diverse set of voices and encourage collaborative and innovative policy formulation that will have a significant impact on Colombian communities. We are so excited to have the space to highlight the experiences and organizations of various members of the Atlantic Council's U.S.-Colombia Advisory Group. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing a distinguished member of this group, Ms. Kristie Pellecchia, founder and principal at Pellecchia International, a financial advisory firm that focuses on strategic advisory in connection with projects and investments in and out of Latin America. Prior to that, Ms. Pellecchia led the Western Hemisphere portfolio for the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, also known as DFC. Kristie, welcome. We are so excited to have you join us today. We are eager to hear your perspective and experiences that will undoubtedly enrich the dialogue between Colombia and the United States. I would like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself, about the nature of your work, and when did you become interested in Colombia?
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thanks to you and the Atlantic Council for having me here today. It's an honor. So my work right now, I work as a financial advisor, as you mentioned, for projects in and out of Latin America. My background prior to that was in finance and banking, almost entirely in the private sector in New York. And I first became interested in Colombia probably when I was about 10 years old, when I started studying Spanish. And then, again, more specifically, I think through Colombian music, actually, by using Shakira's early work as a way to enrich my Spanish. I loved Julieta Venegas and other Colombian stars. And that grew to include many more, like Carlos Vives and Juanes. But when I started covering Latin America at work, I would say about 15 at least years ago, I became fascinated with the reaction that people would have when I would mention Colombia to them. Their perceptions here in the US were very different from what I noticed there. And I was very motivated to want to contribute in some way to change that perception to be closer to reality.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And from an investor development bank perspective that you mentioned, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that you see for Colombia now, particularly in the area of sustainability?
So I think if you think about what investors want, regardless of the jurisdiction, right? It's certainty of cash flows, it's an attractive risk-adjusted return, it's a stable business and legal environment. I think adding sustainability or ESG just adds to the requirements. And it doesn't make it easier. I think it makes it, it's not a substitute for the other things. It's just adding. In terms of the challenges, I would say over the years leading up to 2020, when Colombia received accession into the OECD, it had made remarkable changes to attract large pools of investors that previously could not have considered investing in Colombia because of their investment policies. Then COVID happened. Every country took a hit. However, a number of changes since then in the geopolitical and political rhetoric inside Colombia have created noise for investors. And as a result, foreign direct investment into Colombia has gone down something like 23%. And I just think that this is a huge lost opportunity after all the advances that the country made to get accession into the OECD. Noise isn't good. There are plenty of jurisdictions that investors can look to where they don't have to weed through the noise to understand the investment and how it's going to impact their returns. So I think if you want to have investment, ESG or otherwise, you need to give investors comfort in things like rule of law and certainty. And if not, they're going to find quieter jurisdictions to go to. And so I think that's a huge opportunity. So first, quiet the noise and work on stability. The second, I think, is to attract U.S. developers and convince them that it's a stable place to do business. I think this could help both the U.S. and Colombia in global challenges such as nearshoring. It also plays nicely into sectors where the U.S. is strong. Infrastructure, right? Colombia has a huge infrastructure program, and they've demonstrated huge success on the 4G program, which just finished. if you look at the Bogota Metro, for example, I mean, it shows that the U.S. is absent from Colombian infrastructure. On the first metro line, it went to the Chinese. It's now the second line is up. Looks like the Chinese are going to win that concession as well. And so I think that's a huge opportunity. That I think infrastructure also helps the S in the ESG. It helps the E because, I mean, we've all been to Bogota. It's, the environment, there's a huge amount of traffic, which is terrible. So it would hopefully reduce that. It helps the S because it allows more people to travel more easily into Bogota. And I think, as I mentioned, I think this really presents an opportunity for the U.S. to be present and play a role as China is starting to do in our neighborhood. I think that also from a social perspective, there are a lot of opportunities for women. I mean, I was always impressed and continue to be impressed with the number of influential women in Colombian business and politics. You look at the last administration, the Duque administration, 50% of the ministers were women. You have major businesswomen who have meaningful roles, who are women, and you have entrepreneurial stories like Crepes and Waffles, right? I mean, what a phenomenal story! How do you have more of those? So I think those are some of the opportunities.
Great, thank you. And you have a lot of experience, of course, advising in investment in the investment world. And I want you to kind of give us an example of some of the on-the-ground partners that throughout your career you have been able to partner with. What are some of the major gaps that you're seeing, for example, in access to financing, and how can the U.S. and Colombia kind of collaborate to address those challenges?
So I think, in terms of financing partners that we worked with, I think probably one of the more interesting ones, I've worked in the private sector. I worked with a lot of business, with companies, with nonprofits, with business associations, finance, banking and funds associations, infrastructure associations. When I was at the DFC, we worked closely with the different ministers within the government, to see how to address financing in some of the really more troubled areas of the country. And I think that you have to consider security first and foremost. I mean, if you look at how hard it was to structure, some of these massive toll road projects, to get them to the point where they just kind of happen on repeat, that took years of structuring in a very thoughtful, bankable structure. To go to some of the more remote areas, the first thing that you have to tackle is security. Like that's non-negotiable. It has to be there. Companies aren't going to invest in areas where they think their employees are going to be harmed or their projects are going to be disrupted. So that's number one. I think some of the other areas are things like land rights. Land rights is a huge challenge in Colombia, and then setting up bankable structures, making sure that often means. If you look at toll roads, right, there's so many. I remember the previous administration's PDEP program. Toll roads were a massive part of their plan. But in order for a development bank or anyone else to finance a toll road, they don't want to lose money. And, that very often means that there's going to have, in my opinion, I think that means that there's going to have to be some form of a guarantee structure from Colombian government, U.S. government. And so I think, that needs to have a serious conversation about what's doable on a standalone basis. I think it's also important to get some of the business communities, together to make meaningful businesses so that their products can ultimately be exported. Different types of organizations that work together to obtain market access.
Great. Yeah. And you mentioned risks, right? We're seeing huge security challenges throughout the region. And you mentioned the guarantee structure that is needed as a potential solution to kind of mitigate those risks. Any other additional suggestions that you may have to kind of help investors see the value in Colombia and mitigate some of the risks that we're seeing nowadays in the region?
I really believe that, the absolute first and foremost thing is really quieting the noise. Right. I mean, let's see what's really happening on the ground. You cannot allow the headlines to get to. Colombia made so many progresses through Plan Colombia, up until going through OECD accession. To have headlines of kidnappings in this day, that's not going to bode well for investment. That has to be stopped. I think quiet the noise, have a stable political and investment framework and legal system and security. I think those are absolutely, because Colombia offers so many opportunities for things like renewable energy that could lead the hemisphere, that can be examples, as well as examples for a democratic institution. I mean, Colombia has been a democratic institution for 200 years. The U.S. has had no stronger ally in the entire continent than Colombia's. But those things need to remain, and they need to be promoted in order for investors to see the possibilities.
And I also think that right now we're seeing this narrative, both from the Colombian administration, but also from the U.S. administration, of having a climate-friendly agenda. So my question to you is, how can investments in Colombia contribute to some of the environmental benefits for other parts of the hemisphere and enhance kind of the country's resilience in mitigating some of the climate disasters that we're seeing?
I mean, I think that the way that Colombia can really set the example is, if you look at the continent, it's pretty unstable at the moment, right? There are pockets of instability. I'm not going to say the continent is stable. There are pockets of instability. Colombia has been a very stable beacon of light on the hemisphere. It needs to remain that. In doing so, because of the opportunities for climate-friendly investments, it will set an example, I believe, for the other countries, because you can't have investment if you don't have stability. Investment in climate change and investment in anything else. In terms of the specific opportunities, renewable energy is one. I think conservation is another. I know that Colombia has been advancing its carbon credit program, but just in terms of biodiversity and preservation, they're very focused on that. And I think that can be a key example for other countries. But they have to get the stability. They have to maintain stability in Colombia. It's crucial.
That's a priority for sure. Perfect. So we're almost at time, and I just want to ask a final question before closing up. Do you have any final message, anything else that you would like to portray specifically for policymakers, both in the U.S. and in Colombia?
I think it's very important to remember that the U.S. has not had a stronger ally than Colombia in the region, and we have to nurture and preserve that relationship. And sometimes in relationships, you have to have difficult conversations. We all want to advance climate. We all want to advance clean investment, but you can't have clean investment without a strong basic legal and structural framework for the business community. And it's crucial. And whether a development bank is not set up to lose money. A bank needs a structure to be supportable. So they can play a role, but they're not going to play a role if the framework is not sufficient to support an investment.
Well, thank you so much, Kristie, for sharing your expertise and all of for this insightful conversation. You are, of course, one of our most valued members from the U.S. Colombia Advisory Group. So really excited that you were able to join us today. So thank you very much for taking the time. And thank you to our audience for tuning in, and stay tuned as well for the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thanks for the great work that you and the council do.